Welcome to Esoteric Thoughts. Today I have the privilege of welcoming back to the channel Aaron or Dr. Adair. Aaron, can you talk to us about rationalizing religious myths?
Yeah, it has an interesting long tradition where it comes in spurts, where a philosophical paradigm enters a culture where one way or another you think that the old myths just don't really conform to what's expected, either for moral reasons or because of your understanding of the world. And the two places where it really seems to jump out is in the Greco-Roman world, where, especially amongst the educated elites, they looked at the various old myths of the gods and other, lesser deities. And while they thought that there was, something behind it, it couldn't really be the sorts of things they described. Already, Plato is having troubles with all these stories of Zeus going around and sexually assaulting women as different animals, and all these, terribly immoral things that you can't imagine. Hey, aren't the gods supposed to be better than this? So that's already like a response in there. And so trying to figure out what must be actually going on here. What's the actual truth behind this? Because, well, there must be some sort of truth behind our old religious myths. And in some ways, it can become even more extreme if you basically don't really believe in anything supernatural. And there were various thinkers back then that basically tried to argue all the various odd stories of like centaurs or deities or things like that are all basically various misunderstandings or symbolic stories of something else going on. The most interesting founder of that kind of idea was a guy by the name of Euhemerus. He's living sometime towards the end of the third or fourth century, early third century BC, and he creates this story where the protagonist in the story discovers that actually all of the Olympian gods were all originally regular people. And Zeus was just this great king who basically like set up some of the first cities, created some of the first laws, went on all these grand deeds around the place. And because he was the king, he then later became worshipped for how great he was, and then became worshipped to the point of actually being called an immortal being. But he was always totally immortal, and in fact, you can go to his gravesite that he's buried on the island of Crete, and you can go and visit there. Later on, it actually even became a sacred site that pilgrims went to. They literally went to the tomb of Zeus. And also the other gods were supposed to then be various great things. So Dionysus, he was like the first winemaker. Aphrodite, she was the first really great prostitute. Things like that, rationalizing things that way. And this was a relatively popular way of reconstruing the old myths and stories to try to make them seem more applicable to the newly philosophically minded elites that just figure, well, we understand this thing called nature and how it works by lawful ways. This must be what's actually going on, and what the other people have been saying. Now they're just superstitious rubes, and this loses some steam, especially with the fall of the Roman Empire and standards of education dropping. The Middle Ages are well known for being superstitious. But eventually, once the scientific revolution kicks in, by the 18th century, the idea that, hey, the universe seems to work in this clockwork fashion as described by the laws of Isaac Newton, the realization was, hey, this is how the universe actually works. This is the universe that God has set up. So how do miracles fit into this universe if it's, completely, like I say, like mechanical clockwork? And then the realization, again, it's like, okay, so how do we then deal with all these stories, especially from the Bible? How do we make sense of them? And there was this phase, especially in the late 18th, early 19th century, that are called the rationalists, that take all the stories, especially of Jesus, that seems physically impossible, but it was just a misunderstanding of something going on. The most prominent example of this probably comes from a German in the 1820s, 1830s named Heinrich Paulus. He's basically the pinnacle of this, where he's summarizing a lot of this previous work. And his best example that people point to is explaining, how did Jesus walk on water? And the explanation was, it was a dark and stormy night. The disciples are off on their boat and they're completely lost because of the waves and the fog. They've been tossed around and they don't even realize they've actually been beached. They're actually not in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, but they're actually on the shore. And then as eventually the storm is letting up, things have calmed down and Jesus is then walking to them along the beach, they are thinking, hey, we're in the middle of the water and our Lord Master is coming to us. He's walking on water. It was just a misunderstanding. Repeat that strategy for every single story about Jesus, including his resurrection. So, and eventually people realize this doesn't really fit the story. It sounds absolutely ridiculous. And there are much better explanations of what's actually going on. And eventually, one of the people that helps push this forward is another German by the name of David Friedrich Strauss. He comes out with his book in 1835, and the translation of the title of it is The Life of Jesus Critically Examined. It was a massive book. It got him into huge trouble. He ended up losing his professorship for it. But basically 20 years later, everyone's like, yeah, he's pretty much right. Most of this is, and he used the dreaded 4-letter M word, myth. Obviously in German though, but yeah, he basically said, here's an example of myth, here's another example of myth, here's how we can understand it as mythical. There is something historical to the stories of Jesus, but the vast majority of it is basically just these old literary tropes and allusions to the Old Testament, not the gospel truth of what actually happened. And of course, occasionally you'll still see people trying to apply various rationalistic techniques to this, not so much for like things like the virgin birth or the resurrection, but come the holiday season, especially here in the US, but it's spread out from there, is astronomical explanations for the Christmas star. That has been my main area of research and publication. And it's basically like the one thing that's kind of held on since the 1830s of maybe this is something that we can rationalize and use to accurately date when Jesus was born and show that there's some truth to this part of the story, even though the vast majority of Bible scholars basically dismiss it. They basically said, hey, we tried that 200 years ago, it didn't work, it's not getting any better.
So looking at the composition of the Jesus character, something that's always, as a child, bothered me is trying to get my head around, as you said, the miracles as being literal. I always struggled with that. How do you see the composition of the Jesus character in terms of what's, well, not so much what, but what percentage is real or literal or historical versus astro-theological versus just straight and outright mythology?
Yeah, so in many ways, that's going to relate to also the question of if there is an historical Jesus or not. The vast majority of Bible scholars, of course, will tell you there is, and they'll also tell you anyone who's a mythicist has something wrong with them. I take mythicism more seriously, but even assuming there is an historical Jesus, the question of what can we actually extract from the gospel stories that's historical, I have the opinion that the gospels are so thoroughly mythical and literary that if there's something historical in them, we don't have the tool set to extract that. That has literally been attempted for the last 250 years without success, without any real consensus other than we have no consensus. Yeah, and basically the various tools that have been attempted or created by Bible scholars, when they're critically examined, the people doing the examination admit they don't actually work, they don't actually get reliable results, or they're not even logically sound. So I am unsure, even if there is history in the gospel stories, can we actually pull that out? And conversely, if we take literary or mythical approaches to the stories being told, we make a lot more progress. We can understand how the stories come about. While conversely, if we ask the question, well, what was Matthew's source for the Sermon on the Mount? If you're asking for an historical source, it's very hard to find one, if for no other reason Matthew doesn't say he even has a source that he learned these things from, besides one thing, the Old Testament. Over and over again, the only thing he ever cites for, and this happened because, or he knows what's going on, is citations of the Old Testament. And that's not historical methodology. Even the bad historians of antiquity did a better job of citing their sources if they had any. So the classic example of someone who's considered a less than good historian is Suetonius, especially in the later editions of, or the later emperors in his The Life of the Caesars. he had lost access to the archives of Rome, and he had to rely more and more hearsay. So when he gets to like the life of Nero, while there's definitely things in there that are historically good and reliable, a lot of it is also gossip that had been going around at that time that he's recording as history. And even there, even when he tells like stories of Nero, he still, gives indications of some things are more reliable than others about what's being told. He'll, include phrases like some people say that, or it's alleged that, and other things he'll speak more straightforwardly. So he even distanced himself from the more difficult to believe things. Matthew, on the other hand, is basically, no, totally it was the case that a whole bunch of dead saints came out of their tombs and walked in Jerusalem, were seen by tons of people. And no one else seemed to notice. No other gospel author even wanted to touch that with a 10-foot pole. When someone is writing stories like that and providing not even a single reason why you should believe them, you might have good reason to doubt they even have a source. While conversely, when they show that they are using the Old Testament to basically construct their story, maybe you should believe that's how they primarily came up with their stories, not from oral traditions or long-lived people, writing things down just before they died. It seems so much more to understand things as theological expressions, not historical recollections.
So looking at astro-theology as a from a rationalization point of view of understanding these religious myths, or as a source for these religious myths, what's your views on astro-theology?
Yeah. So as I understand it, astro-theology being the thesis that the various stories or myths that exist in a variety of world religions are derivative of looking at the stars, the constellations that are seen in those stars, and then using that to create some other new narrative. Whether it's the narrative of the life of Jesus, that Jesus is actually the sun moving through the zodiac, as you see in like films like Zeitgeist, or maybe the suggestion that other constellations are the source of things in Homer or the like, that being the basic thesis. So in some cases, it does definitely look like someone is looking at the constellations and using that to create their narrative, or at least color their narrative. And we even have examples of Jews and Christians doing that. When it comes to Jewish sources that we are reasonably sure are doing that, there is a work known as the Sibylline Oracles. It's actually a large collection of works, and some parts are old, some parts are medieval. Specifically, most of what is in Book 5 of the Sibylline Oracles is figured to have been written during the reign of Emperor Hadrian, so probably maybe in the 130s AD. And it's mostly an apocalyptic text. It's, saying doom and gloom against the various enemies of the Jewish people. And in the final phase of the narrative, it talks about basically a war in heaven. And it talks about all these various constellations fighting each other. So like Scorpion versus Leo, the Morning Star riding Leo into battle and fighting other people. And then all the stars then being thrown down as for the end of the world. So it's like, hey, there's an example of someone literally taking the constellations and turning that into narrative. And even this trope of the constellations fighting is actually not even original to this. In the century before, Seneca had his own version of this as well. Centuries later, another guy by the name of Nonus Panopoulos in his Dionysica also has his own, what is often called a star war, if for no other reason, because it's a good name. So we definitely have examples of that. We have examples of Christians who will say, Jesus is actually the constellation Ophiuchus because he's the serpent bearer, and they associated serpents with Satan. And so when they look at Ophiuchus, this is supposed to be Jesus holding back the powers of darkness, the powers of Satan. You could even say they're with the cult of Mithras. That has lots of astrological symbolism. And so it definitely has a whole lot of things that you would call astro-theology. So there are definitely religions, religious cults, religious groups that are doing that. Where I would say that sometimes it goes too far in astro-theology is trying to explain the entirety of world religions based on the constellations. It's very often the case that it seems like there are myths first and then they're put into the sky, rather than vice versa. Because after all, the constellations themselves don't actually exist. Those are always human projections of what we think we see in the sky, and it's very subjective. The constellations that we have grown up with in the West aren't the same as if you go to China. It's so radically different, and because, well, they're not putting things together for all sorts of historical reasons. If you happen, I don't think we know that much about the constellations of the Maya. I don't know enough there, but I have good reason to doubt they had a constellation of a lion, because lions don't populate Mesoamerica. So you wouldn't expect Leo to exist there for that very reason. And on the other hand, if I look up in the sky today, when I look for Leo, I don't actually look for a lion. I look for the thing that I call the backwards question mark, because that's what's obvious to me. But again, if I was living in 2000, if I lived 2000 years ago, I wouldn't have called it the question mark, because that punctuation mark didn't exist. It's again, our projections onto the sky. So using our projections to say what our myths were, I think is a little bit backwards, because we already had these myths and then we projected them onto the sky rather than in a reverse. There obviously are plenty of exceptions, I think, to that, but I think the general case is we have the stories and we're putting them into the heavens. And of course, with various changes along the way, especially since when different groups would come in contact with each other, they'll have different constellations. The Greeks had some series of their own constellations before they learned about the version from the Babylonians. And ultimately, the version that has become like the standard set of constellations seen in the Northern Hemisphere, that's actually amalgamation of older Greek and earlier Babylonian ones. So it's actually a mixture, and only really came and solidified sometime around maybe 300 BC. They're not quite as old in many ways as we first might have thought. So there's all that history and complexity there. So where does astro-theology work? I would say very much a case-by-case basis, and it just has to be, where's the evidence that we can use to show it's more likely the case of where a myth comes from than something else.
Dr. Dennis MacDonald, who I've interviewed many times, does an excellent job of proving that a lot of the Gospels comes from the epics of Homer and the Odyssey. As a doctor, how do you see people who, despite seeing the clear evidence that there are older myths, the biblical stories come from older myths, psychologically, how do you see them in terms of rejecting the myths and but believing the Bible?
So there's going to be probably two strands to that, because for those who are biblical literates who think that everything in the Bible happened just as is described, then saying, no, this was written to just emulate the epics of Homer is just a no-go. That's just, theologically impossible for them. But the argument is, I think, more interesting if we go to critical scholars who are willing to say this and that story about Jesus isn't likely historical, and then the question of where does the story come from, and how do we now interpret it based on that? So if one is willing to accept that various stories about Jesus are not historically true, the believer will probably still say it's still somehow theologically important or theologically true. But to make that argument often is the case by saying, well, Jesus is fulfilling prophecy. That's probably the most clear again in Matthew, where he's saying over and over again, such and such happened in fulfillment of what the scripture said. That view gets knocked down pretty hard if we're saying such and such story wasn't there to fulfill prophecy, but was to look more and more like a trope that was common in the Greco-Roman world. The more and more it looks like the Gospel of Mark isn't emulating scripture, but another source, the less theological power those stories might have, because now it's being derived from paganism. It's now coming from some outside source that doesn't have the stamp of approval of being divinely inspired, unless one wants to now argue that Homer was divinely inspired and the Iliad should be added to the canon, which honestly I'm not against. At the very least, the epics of Homer, I think, are much better and easier to read than the genealogies from the Old Testament, to say the least. Though Homer does have sections that are just big lists of names. Book 2 is just a big list of names of people who showed up and what ships they came on to fight in the Trojan War. And it's a snooze fest. So even Homer will succumb to boring storytelling. But nonetheless, if one doesn't think Homer is divinely inspired, but it's the inspiration to a gospel story, it undermines the inspiration of that gospel story. I think that's a big part of what would make a believer but critical scholar balk at that, and then look for any possibility of saying, well, this part is a little bit different, or no, or probably most importantly, the various early commenters on the Bible, on the New Testament, don't make those same allusions. They're not saying, oh, this is just like the woman washing Jesus' feet is just like the person washing Odysseus's feet. They don't see that connection, or they don't say they see that connection. And so basically the idea is, if the church fathers didn't see it, it's not real. There is some weight to that. If Justin Martyr, for example, in the 150s, were saying, and Mark is clearly emulating but surpassing the wisdom of Odysseus by redoing this story, that would have been really powerful evidence for MacDonald's thesis. The fact that it's not there is at least a little bit surprising if it was supposed to be there and obvious to the educated reader. Now, MacDonald's, though, has a good response that there are Byzantine writers who definitely see the connections. They definitely clearly see that. And again, I would say, of course, the reason people like Justin Martyr aren't saying, and this is coming from Homer, is for the same reason the modern theologian doesn't want to. It undermines the authority of it. The way that you see a lot of the early Christian commenters argue for the truth of the New Testament is saying how it fulfills what's said in the Old Testament. That also gets undermined by saying it's out of Homer, or it's out of the Bacchae, things like that. So yeah, I think a lot of it is that sort of theological reaction to what this thesis would imply, because yeah, I think MacDonald's thesis is sound, his methodology is logical, and the evidence he provides is sufficient to say at least some, if not very many, of the stories in Mark are derivative of Homeric stories.
So from a historical perspective, my understanding is that in putting the canons together, there was an understanding that these stories were that of myths. But what was the change, or when was the change to the literal, or more of a literal interpretation of the Bible? Was that during the Reformation, during the 1600s?
I'm not so sure. So, I mean, there were definitely people early on that said stories, sorry, in the New Testament weren't historically true, but still spiritually true. That's something straight out of Origen, writing in the 3rd century. So early on, there definitely were people who were saying that there was not necessarily complete historical truth. But more often than not, the argument would be that there is both spiritual and historical truth. I think if you asked Martin Luther, did Jesus walk on water? He would have said yes. But where it then becomes this sort of absolutist, no, this actually must have happened, seems to be much more a product of modernity, with the scientific revolution coming in and showing basically the scientific method works in this system of facts and evidence gathering and hypothesis testing. Sometimes I actually see that literally in the theologians of the 19th century, in particular, a theologian by the name of Charles Hodge. He's basically like the founder of the theological seminary at Princeton, or at least he was like its main leader for his whole life. And then when he died, it was taken over by his son. So like this family tradition of running Princeton Theological Seminary. And he wrote this book, I think it might be the first book, with the title Systematic Theology. And when he starts it, and he says, we are going to treat the Bible like the scientist treats nature. The scientist goes out to nature to collect facts. We, the theologian, will go to the Bible to get facts to create our system. So that idea that the Bible is a fact book, and that you pull the facts out to create your theology, to create your theory of interpretation, that is directly influenced by scientific modeling. So I think That is a part of it. And then being really hardcore on literalism is also itself a reaction to modernism in the late 19th century. That is most clear in the US with what was a controversy in the 1880s, if I remember correctly. A new professor had started at Union Theological Seminary in New York after this person had gone off to Berlin to learn about higher biblical criticism there. And he brought that back and basically was like, yeah, Moses didn't write the Pentateuch because stories of Jesus are largely unhistorical, things like that. And that caused a gigantic crisis in the churches there. And that professor was actually put on heresy trials multiple times for his views. And this basically is usually seen as the starting point of what's called like the modernist fundamentalist controversy. And then the fundamentalists coming in and arguing for it, like, the complete absolute truth of the Old and New Testament, that everything happened at 100% literally. In the 1910s, I think it was, they wrote a series of pamphlets called The Fundamentals. And this is actually then where the term fundamentalist comes from for treating this group of people. And then this, of course, is also in time for all the high times of anti-evolutionism in the 1910s, 1920s, most famously again in the US with the Scopes monkey trial in 1925, where evolution is put on trial in this small town and it becomes this giant media circus as well. So I see a lot of modern literalism and fundamentalism as a reaction to modernism and liberalism, and the thought that if we go down the routes of esoteric or subjective interpretation, we lose the actual truth, that we don't have that solid foundation. And so this is the pushback against that if we don't have our fundamentals, we're just a castle built on sand, and it'll just fall over and lead to all sorts of terrible things. And at that time, they had things that they could point to, especially in the 1910s. The fundamentalists were pointing to the failure of modernism and liberalism by looking at what was happening in the trenches in Europe of World War I. And there were all these alleged stories of people in the trenches basically saying that they were, willing to kill and slaughter people because we're just a bunch of animals because of evolution, so it doesn't matter. The stories weren't apparently all that historically authentic, but nonetheless, seeing the meat grinder that was the Western Front and the millions of people just throwing their lives away with modern technology, it just seemed like this was a complete failure of the ideas of the progressive movement that, humanity can get better and better on its own. It's like, no, we need the old time religion. And well, they were definitely right. There were failures of the beliefs at that time because World War I definitely proved we hadn't figured peace out. But fundamentalism wasn't the savior either.
Aaron, thank you for joining us on Esoteric Thoughts today. Thank you.
My pleasure.